Hey folks, this is chapter 35 of your textbook. Today we're going to be talking about how animals behave, what makes their behavior the behavior of each individual species, and how different animals respond to changes in their environment. So a few years ago there was a show on Animal Planet called Meerkat Manor, and it followed this family of these relatives of the mongoose called meerkats, and documented how they interacted with each other and how they defended themselves, foraged for food, faced predators, and they also were able to make some hypotheses. The researchers that were following these animals were able to use that observational information to draw some hypotheses about the evolution of them, including how their behavior, how they cooperated with one another and behaved in connection with each other, how they selected partners, sexual partners, and other components of their social behavior. So this is a great example of that process of using observational information to draw scientific conclusions. So in this chapter, the big ideas that we're going to cover are how behavior is studied, how animals can learn, the importance of reproductive success in the survival of a species, and then the social behavior of different types of animals, and we'll introduce you to the study of sociobiology. Okay, so there are scientists that study behavior, and there are a lot of questions to ask and a lot of information that's been collected over the years. But behavioral ecologists ask a number of different types of questions, and there are two broad categories of study of how behavior evolves in a species. So the word behavior is really, what do we mean by that? It's really all of the animal's responses to internal and external environmental cues. So it's how an animal responds to its environment. And this study of how animals' behaviors influence, their behavior influences how they grow and develop and reproduce and evolve. And as I mentioned, there are two broad categories of studies of behavior: the study of proximate causes and the study of ultimate causes. Proximate causes, those are things that, those are an immediate response to a stimulus. So that's how an animal behaves in response to something immediately. Whereas ultimate causes are how is more of the evolutionary adaptations in behavior over time. Sorry, my slides are laggy with their time here. So there are some different types of patterns of behavior that are identified in organisms. There's innate behavior. So this is something that all members of a species do in the same way. And at these patterns of these kind of unchangeable series of innate behaviors are actually referred to as a fixed action pattern. So these ensure that activities that are essential to survival are performed correctly in all individuals of the species without any type of learning or practice. So this is something that you could also refer to these as an animal's instincts. So an example of this type of behavior is a baby bird, the baby birds that automatically open their mouths when the mom returns to the nest with some food. If you've ever seen it, you can see videos of it. They all immediately, like it's all at the same time, the baby birds open their big wide mouths when they get the stimulus of their mother returning to the nest. Or father. We'll talk about that in a bit. So behavior can be a result of both genetic factors, like we mentioned, we just talked about with the innate behavior of the baby birds, just genetically being preconditioned to opening their mouths when when food is available. But behavior can also be is in response to environmental factors. So scientists are constantly studying the differences between these two factors, the genetic component and the environmental response, and trying to understand which behaviors are influenced in which way. So an example of environmental factors affecting the behavior of certain animals, it's been found that baby sea turtles that hatch on the beaches of the coastline, their response, their behavior is influenced by the environment. So they almost always hatch at night, and their innate behavior, they have an innate response to be attracted towards the moonlight and the surf, the white surf and the moonlight hitting the water. So that's how they know to head towards the water. There have been, over the years, where sea turtles nest in beach towns. They're often places that are really popular with tourism, so they would have streets with streetlights, and usually those streets with streetlights would line the beach and kind of go along the beach. And they were finding that the baby sea turtles, after they hatched, were heading towards the road and getting run over by cars and much more susceptible to predation. And what they found was that the artificial streetlights were mimicking the natural moonlight, and it was causing the behavior of the baby sea turtles to be influenced by their environment. So if you've noticed, if you've been to a beach town in the last few years, they almost, if it's a turtle nesting habitat, there are no streetlights along the beaches, because they've discovered that the turtles are much more successful in making it to the water and being protected in areas where there are no streetlights along the beach. And an example of how we know that genetics can also influence behavior. There was a study of these fruit flies. Fruit flies are often the subject of genetic testing because they have a really short lifespan, and they reproduce very quickly, and it's easy to observe them over the whole course of the life cycle for many generations. So it was found that their male fruit flies have this gene that's called the fruitless gene, or abbreviated as FRU, the fru gene. And the ones that had it, the males that had the normal fru gene, would court females in the normal way that mating should occur in that species. However, if they had a mutated fru gene, they would court males instead of females. So this courting and mating behavior in these fruit flies is actually genetically connected to a specific gene. They were also able to manipulate the genetics of some of these flies and introduce the fru gene into some of the female fruit flies, and in that case, those female fruit flies would act like the males and try to court the females in the mating rituals. So this is an example of how genetics can influence behaviors. Okay, so not all behavior is that innate behavior that we've been talking about. Animals can learn and grow and change their behavior as a result of learning. So when we're talking about learning, this is how an animal's behavior changes as a result of experiencing things. So there are a few different types of learning. The first being habituation. And this is just an animal learns not to respond to a stimulus that it experiences over time, over and over time. So for example, a community of birds, if you put up a scarecrow to keep them out of your veggie patches, you put up a scarecrow. At first, it will scare the birds away, but over time, as they become more and more exposed to that scarecrow and they realize that it really is little to no threat, they'll start to be habituated to the fact that it's there. So they'll stop responding to that scarecrow stimulus and start entering the garden anyway. And there are a few other types of learning that we'll talk about. Next, we'll talk about this idea of imprinting. And if you've seen or read the vampire books, I think that's talked about in there. I think what we're going to talk about is a little bit different. We'll also talk about how spatial learning occurs, how associative learning occurs, how we can adapt behaviors based on reward and punishment. And then we'll wrap up by talking about social learning and how there are some species that can even perform some problem-solving skills. Okay, so as I mentioned, imprinting is the next type of learning. This is a learning that's limited to a specific time period in an animal's life, and it's generally an irreversible thing. So typically this is something that happens very early in the life cycle of an animal because it's limited to a phase in the animal's development when it can still learn certain behaviors. And this is called the sensitive period. So imprinting occurs during this sensitive period. So examples of this are young birds that learn to identify their parents as soon as they're born, and how and song development in birds. In fact, there were some studies done where I think they were geese that were born and separated. So some were immediately put with their natural mother, and some were brought up by the scientist. And even as those birds became adults, the ones that had been brought up by the scientist had imprinted with that scientist, and they thought that was their flock. So that was the leader of their flock, not the actual mother. So that was this imprinting during the sensitive period. So sometimes that imprinting can cause problems, but sometimes it's actually been used for conservation of species that are nearing extinction. So for example, there have been situations where bird eggs have been artificially incubated in captivity with no parents available as models for imprinting. So there's the concern that those offspring may not learn the appropriate behaviors. But there are situations where this has been successful, and the effort to save the whooping crane is one example of a program that successfully used puppets in order to teach the whooping cranes how to be natural whooping cranes. They actually used the puppets would feed the birds, the baby birds, as they were developing, and over time they actually even disguised a little plane as an adult whooping crane and helped to teach these birds how to fly, and their population has increased tremendously since this experiment took place. Okay, so the next type of learning that animals can do is referred to as spatial learning. So again, this is in response to some kind of stimulus. And kinesis, so there are a few different types of this movement in response to a stimulus. The first being called kinesis. And this is sort of a random movement in response to some kind of stimulus. So an example of this is there are these little critters called sow bugs that are quite common, but they really like to live in moist soils. If the soil's really dry, they'll start to move around quite rapidly, and that is a response to the dryness in an effort to find a more moisture-rich environment. Another response is that's directed towards either a positive or negative stimulus. This is called taxis. So an example of this is how a salmon or other stream fish will direct themselves in one way or another in order to receive food. So they're typically orient themselves so their mouths are headed upstream so that food flowing down the stream would be available for them. And then in spatial learning, this is so things like migration. This is how animals establish memories of landmarks in their environment that help them to remember where they're likely to find food and be able to remember or have a spatial sense of where their home or nest site is. And actually they can even learn to spatially locate potential hazards and learn where those are and stay away from those areas. So I mentioned migration. Migration is one of these, is one example of this spatial learning. It's this regular back and forth movement of animals between two geographic locations. So we typically think about migration in birds because there are quite a few migratory bird species, but other animals do this as well, and they use different types of cues from the environment in order to navigate where they need to travel during their migration. So for example, gray whales will navigate using the topography of the ocean floor, so the actual physical changes in the ocean floor. They also get cues from the temperature and the chemistry of the water, and they have some ability to sense magnetic features in the Earth's magnetic field as well. Likewise, I talked about the baby sea turtles. Sea turtles they live a very long time, and they have a migratory pattern that lasts years. But typically, a sea turtle will be born on the coasts of like Florida and the Carolinas, and it will travel this migratory path for several years and actually return back to the same location it had been born on the east coast of the United States. So they do this primarily using, again, magnetic cues from the Earth's magnetic field. So another way that animals learn to associate, learn from stimuli in their environment, is through associative learning. This is the ability to associate something in the environment with some kind of feature. So learns to link that stimulus to what happens to them as a result of coming in contact with that stimulus. And then there's also trial and error, where they may try something and learn that that's not a good response, I'm not going to do that again. Or they may get a positive effect and find that their trial was a good one, and that's behavior that they'll learn to do again. So associative learning, an example of that is how dogs can actually learn words. They connect the behavior that their response gets. That's why when we're training dogs, we use food as a reward. They learn that you say sit. When they sit, they get a reward. They learn that they associate the word with the response of sitting and getting a reward. Whereas trial and error learning is, say, encountering a porcupine or a skunk or some kind of animal that if you approach it, you get either stung or stuck with the needle, with the quills, and you learn that those are things that you want to stay away from. Okay, so we also learn, animals of all kinds also learn through social interaction with individuals of the same species and individuals of other species as well. So for example, many predators like cats learn basic needs like hunting for food by observing and imitating their mothers. And there are also a species of monkey in Kenya that have different calls for different types of predators. So they can actually learn from each other that a certain type of call might mean a predator from the air, whereas another type of call might be a predator that's approaching from the ground, and they actually have different responses to the different calls through this social interaction of this communication. And then I mentioned that there are some species that actually can do problem solving, not just the ones that we suspect, like mammals, like dolphins and primates, but there are actually some bird species that have learned some problem solving skills. And this idea of problem solving behavior, it relies on cognition. And this is the process carried out by an animal's nervous system, how an animal uses information collected by the senses to do a task. So there are birds that have actually been fed by putting hanging a string with food tied to the string. The bird can learn to actually use its talon to pull those string up and get the food. So it's this idea of cognition leading to problem-solving behavior. Okay, so moving on from learning, how does behavior influence a species' survival and their reproductive successes? So all animals we know need to eat to survive and reproduce. So it's really important for them to have some kind of food obtaining behavior. We call this foraging. And this is how an animal identifies, obtains, and eats their food. So they actually, it's been discovered that they actually have what we've referred to as a search image. And this is a mental picture of the desired food that they want to eat. It helps them to have this image so that it's more easily identified and expedites the foraging process. So a way to predict an animal's feeding behavior is referred to as the optimal foraging model. And this predicts that the feeding behavior, predicts feeding behavior based on the fact that an animal's going to want to try to find food in order to maximize how much energy they gain from the food, at the same time as minimizing how much energy and risk they have to expend on obtaining it. So the best foraging behavior is a balance between this energy gain and expenditure, risk and energy expenditure. So we talked a little bit already about communication with some of those monkey calls, but communication is an essential element, not just in humans, but between all types of animals. So these interactions between animals depends often on some kind of signaling. And communication can be verbal or audible, a noise stimulus. It can also be a chemical communication, or it can also be light and visual communication between animals of the same species. So in behavioral ecology, a signal is whatever kind of stimulus is transmitted from one animal to another. So again, that being the words, it can be flashes of light and lightning bugs. It can be chemical interactions between plankton communities. So it's just that any kind of signal that's transmitted from one animal to another, and the sending and receiving of those signals is what we refer to as communication. So we're not just talking about language here. So, as I mentioned, these forms of communications can vary greatly, and it depends on the type of animal. So there are nocturnal animals that may use odor and sound rather than visual cues. Birds that live in the daytime but may hide from predators use auditory signals, but they may also use visual signals. So we'll talk a little bit about mating rituals. That is a form of communication that are very visual in their method of communication. There are fish that can use electrical signals or sound that works underwater. And there's actually a really interesting study on how honeybees perform this really interesting dance called a waggle dance to communicate with one another. So this is an image sort of depicting this little waggle dance, and this is how these honeybees help each other find food. So again, this waggle dance, it communicates the distance and direction of food. So a dancer, one of the little dancer bees, will find a source of food and will head back to the hive. And when it does that, it runs in a half circle, and then it runs in a straight line back to the starting point, buzzes their wings and wiggle their abdomen, and then they run a half circle in the other direction, and again go back to their starting point. So this is a way that they can communicate the angle of where the food is located and how far away it is, so that other members of the hive will be able to locate the same food source that the honeybee has communicated where it is. And as I mentioned, sometimes there are mating rituals which can be need careful communication in order for the species to select its mate and successfully reproduce. And this happens in a lot of different species. They have some kind of mating ritual, and it confirms that the individuals are ready for, that are physically primed and ready for mating, and they're not threats to one another. So here, hopefully I can play this little video. This is an albatross, which is a bird doing a mating ritual in order to communicate with one another that they're in love. Okay, so mating rituals, mating systems. There are a couple different types of behaviors in mating that, again, are geared towards enhancing the success of reproducing and having viable, successful offspring. So the general purpose of mating and reproducing is for genes to be passed on in offspring. So if in order for that to happen, that offspring needs to survive. So the needs of the offspring really determines what kind of different mating systems are used by the parents, and that depends on what type of species we're talking about. So these different mating systems fall into three categories. Promiscuous, which is what it sounds like. That means that no strong bond is formed between the males and females. They just kind of randomly mate. There are monogamous. There even aside from humans, there are some species that have a monogamous, one male and one female, and shared parental care. And then there's polygamous mating systems, where typically it's one female and the male will have several female mating partners. Again, what type of mating system is adopted by a species, or I guess not adopted, but is performed by a species, typically depends on how necessary it is for the paternity to be certain for the success of the offspring. So when I say certainty of paternity, in animals where internal fertilization occurs, it's not always clear. It's not always they're not always able to clearly know who the father is. So this it affects how much energy the male really will expend in protecting the offspring. So if they're not certain that they're genetically connected to this or this other individual, it's not really in their best interest to expend a lot of care on that offspring. But there are examples where external fertilization happens. This happens a lot in fish, where the eggs are laid and then fertilized. And the certainty of paternity is much, much higher, and those males will take a much more active role in ensuring the success of that offspring. For example, male seahorses will house and protect the fertilized eggs until during the incubation process, until the eggs hatch and the individuals are born. Okay, so here's a question. Why then is it that birds are more likely to form monogamous pairs than mammals are? Just think about that for a second. So this one has to do a lot with how the two different types of animals feed. So in many species of birds, a single parent can't provide enough food to ensure the survival of the young. So the males enhance their reproductive success by feeding the offspring along with the mother. However, the offspring of mammals are fed by the mother's milk. So the fathers are much less involved in and much less needed in the care of the offspring at the beginning. Okay, so moving from mating behaviors to things in our environments that can cause abnormal behavior to occur. So you may have heard about this in the news. Again, we talked in the last chapter about pollution, and we specifically mentioned the use of this pesticide DDT. So there are these things that are referred to as endocrine disruptors, and what they do, they're chemical pollutants that cause some kind of disruption in the endocrine system of animals. So they often do this by mimicking some kind of hormone or having the same influence on an organism that a hormone will, or they may actually cause the inhibition of hormones to act normally in the animal's body. So as I said, we mentioned DDT. A lot of times these are things that are discharged from paper and lumber mills, can be industrial waste, runoff from agricultural practices, and as I mentioned, DDT, and there are still other pesticides that are still used, but DDT is actually still being found in soils and waters, even though it hasn't been used since the late 70s, early 80s maybe. So it's been linked to, as I mentioned, a lot of that can cause this abnormal behavior to occur. So it might cause fish to not worry about where their territory is, so they don't defend against predators. They might have, there are salamanders that are not, no longer mating because they're not responding to the mating cues. Sloppy nest building in birds. Mice that take risks in being preyed upon, and reduced nest guarding behavior in male sticklebacks. And there's also those are behavioral responses to this chemical pollution, but there are also some biological results of this as well. So there are actually some male fish in polluted environments that are developing eggs, even though they're males. There are a lot of hermaphroditic frogs being found that are, again, in aquatic frogs that are that have both male and female sexual reproductive structures, and a lot of times there are other reproductive abnormalities, which again is linked to the mimicking or inhibition of hormones. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of the chapter that we're going to talk about how social behavior and this study of sociobiology, how social behavior is important in the success of a species. So, what is sociobiology? And this is a discipline of science that applies the study of evolution to the study and interpretation of how a species behaves. So it's the study of how adaptations are adopted and passed on through social interactions between species. So the social behavior is any kind of interaction between two or more animals. It don't have to be animals of the same species, but just some type of interaction. So different types of this social behavior there are different types of this social behavior. One being animals can be territorial. So they can exhibit communication that shows that their territory is their territory, and they're they want you to stay out. So what we mean by a territory, this is an area usually in a fixed location that one or more individuals defend from other members coming in and out. Or usually areas where that group of animals feeds and mates and rears their young. And they typically are continually proclaiming their territorial rights. So we've seen this happen in many ways, but if you've ever heard about a dog marking its territory, that's really what they do. So coyotes and other species of wild dogs will mark their territory by urinating around it and giving that chemical cue that back off, this is our spot. Songbirds do it through song. So there are a lot of birds that will use calls to keep other birds out of their territory. Okay, so that's territorial social behavior. But there's also this other social behavior called agonistic behavior. And this is when a conflict arises over some kind of limited resource, whether it's food or mates or territory. It can be this sort of exaggerated posturing. If you've seen birds that will put their wings up to make themselves look really big. It can be male deer doing their competition where they butt their heads and wrestle their antlers. So this is typically some kind of defense or some kind of aggressive behavior that allows the winner to outcompete the loser and thus be able to pass on and show that they're more evolutionarily fit to pass on their genetic information. There are lots of animals that live in social groups that rely heavily on this agonistic behavior, and they actually develop what's called a dominance hierarchy. So these are things, for example, hierarchies among wolves in a wolf pack. There's like an alpha male and an alpha female. Pecking orders in chickens is a real thing. When you put a bunch of hens together, they'll actually start pecking at one another, and the one that is sort of the top dog is able to sort of be the boss or the leader in this dominance hierarchy. So, a lot of social behaviors can be quite selfish because that's the best way for natural selection to favor the survival and reproductive success of the dominant individual. But there's also this behavior, societal behavior called altruism, and this is a behavior that will reduce the individual's success and fitness, but it increases the fitness of the rest of the population. So it's kind of like the guy who will take one for the team. Oh, so, sorry, just going back one. This altruistic behavior, again, the selfish behavior, it increases the success of the individual, but it leaves fewer resources for the rest of the individuals. So altruism is often in communities of animals that live in some kind of cooperative community. So an example of this are honeybees. So honeybees live in a community. If a predator tries to get in, their reaction is to sting them. The individual that stings the intruder often dies, but it leaves a more fit environment for the rest of the population. So these altruistic acts can also often be explained by this concept that we're going to introduce called inclusive fitness. So this describes that an individual's success at passing along its genetic information by producing its own offspring, and also helping relatives who share a lot of the same genetic information, that you also want that information to be passed on. So it's altruistic behavior. It's behavior that may risk the individual to help pass on closely related individuals. So we're referring to what we call kin selection. So this is natural selection favoring the reproduction of closely related individuals. So there's a classic study of this by a scientist named Belding, who studied these squirrels and provided this support of this idea of that there are species that do kin selection. So what this was, that there are these squirrels have females that always stay very close and live very close to the burrows that they were born in, and the males will move further away. So what happens then is that the females have a lot of close relatives nearby and the males do not. So what happened in this study is it found that the calls when the squirrels, if one of them was sensing a predator or an intruder into the colony, they would call out in alarm to alert the other squirrels to go hide in your burrow. Almost always those calls came from females with close relatives nearby. So it was showing that there's the female might come out of her burrow to make the call to make sure that all of her sisters and cousins and closely related friends got the message to go hide. So in the last chapter, we talked about, I guess it was last semester, you guys were introduced to the idea that there are a couple different types of science. You can study science through experimental manipulation, or through this idea of observing the natural world and drawing conclusions through observational data collection. So there's a very famous scientist named Jane Goodall who has spent decades studying chimpanzees and has lived among them for months at a time, with the goal of understanding how they think and what their social behavior looked like. And her research found that chimpanzees were actually making and using tools, that they weren't just vegetarians, they actually did eat meat as well, that they had this close bond between the chimpanzee mother and the offspring that lasted several years. The mom and the baby will have a very close bond that is not just the way many animals are, it's sort of a brief period. And she also documented a lot of interesting information about how they searched for food, and that there would actually be small groups that would go off and forage for the group. And often that was the mom and the babies bringing food back to the pack. So again, this is how observational science helped us have a greater understanding of this group of animals. And when I mentioned that they were using tools, they were actually like using plants and twisting up the leaves in a way that they could stick it into a termite nest and actually scoop out. It's kind of like using the leaves as a spoon to scoop out the bugs and eat them that way. Before her discovery of that use, it was thought that humans really were the first to ever develop and use tools. So again, her pioneering research really demonstrates how observational science is done, how we can use qualitative information, not just something that you measure from an experiment, to develop the world of science. And she also she's still living, and she's still very, very much active. She's really bridged the gap between the general public and scientists through writing books that are not just scientific jargon, and she's an amazing lecturer. I actually had the opportunity to see her when I was in college, and she's been on a number of television appearances as well. So she's a pretty fascinating and an excellent communicator of science to the general public. And this is Jane with her chimps. She actually spent about a half a century communicating that we're not the only aware and reasoning beings on the planet. Okay, so finally, to wrap up this chapter, there's that age-old question of nature versus nurture. And that's what we're going to talk about here, the genetic factors in behavioral traits and the role of environmental or nurturing behaviors, or nurturing influences in shaping how an individual behaves. So we're talking about, in people, personality or temperament or talents, whether or not you have different intellectual abilities, what kinds of influences makes a person a unique individual. Is it genetics, or is it nurture? Is it how our environment has shaped us? And the answer is yes. It is definitely both. So there have been a few studies that have been done on twins, because twins kind of provide this like natural laboratory where we can investigate genetic differences, genetic similarities and genetic differences between two people that you don't necessarily have in the rest of the society. So moving on to my picture here. So these results from twin studies show that there are a lot of complex behavioral traits like intelligence and personality characteristics. And genetics, yes, counts for some of that, but only about half of the variation among individuals. Genes don't really dictate behavior. Instead, they dictate the tendency towards a behavior to react to the environment in a certain way. So these are identical twins, meaning that they have the exact same DNA sequence and they were raised in the same environment. So what studies from identical versus fraternal twins can show us are some of these variations in the DNA sequence, because fraternal twins, so these guys are James and Oliver Phelps, and I think they're from, well, Harry Potter, because he's in the background there. And then there are fraternal twins like Scarlett Johansson and her brother Hunter. So they share half of their genetic information. They're not identical. They don't have identical DNA, so the differences can also be studied. So the mechanisms and underlying genetics of behavior are, going back to the beginning of this talk, those are proximate causes. They're immediate reactions. They're how we behave to immediate stimulus that we come in contact with. So this idea of sociobiology centers on the idea that social behavior evolves, like anatomical traits. It's an expression of our genes that have been passed on through natural selection. So it's unlikely that most human behavior is programmed by our genetic information, but it gives us a predisposition to what kinds of responses to those proximate, immediate responses that we're going to have. So it selects genetic traits that more readily allow children to learn how to adapt to different environmental cues that they're going to have. And that is all for this chapter. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Have a great day, everybody.